Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Go Camp Pro. We have created and are dedicated to this podcast because we believe that staff training is one of, if not the most important part of your job as a camp director. Staff training is what prepares your staff to care for their campers, to feel confident in their skills, to do their jobs to the best of their ability, and to learn along the way. A well thought out and intentional staff training will help you in more ways than you can imagine, and we need to help each other bring our very best. And before we dive in our topic today, we're going to start off with some introductions. So Beth, will you start us off today?
Absolutely. I'm Beth Allison. I'm co-owner of Camp Hacker and Go Camp Pro. I was a camp director for 15 years, and now I am a camp consultant with my husband. And my true focus and passion is intentional leadership training.
Awesome. And Gabrielle?
Well, my name's Gabrielle Rail, and I'm one of the camp directors at Camp Oro. Camp Oro is an all-girls camp in the Laurentian Mountains in Quebec, and we focus on creating a positive female community, and we do this in French and English.
Casual. So great. And my name is Ruby Compton, and I'm the Chief Exploration Officer for Ruby Outdoors. I work as a freelance camp director here in Western North Carolina, and throughout the off-season help Go Camp Pro with their master classes and coordinating those and getting to take a lot of professional development and offer lots of professional development for all you awesome camp pros out there. So we're so glad you're joining us today. Our topic today are staff meetings, are training too. And Beth is going to tell us a little bit about why we chose this topic today.
Staff meetings are such an important part of our camp experience. They are used primarily to disseminate information, but if it's done well, it can also suss out how your staff is doing, handling certain situations. They can build stronger community and teach new skills. So like everything else we talk about on Camp Code, we want to run our staff meetings with intention for the best outcomes for our people.
I love it. So true. And so we're going to jump right in. And I know that some of our other podcasts in the Go Camp Pro family have talked about staff meetings already. So if you haven't checked out, there's a Day Camp Pod episode about it as well. So we encourage you to check that out, and wanted to also offer some of our own ideas. So staff meetings are training. Let's talk about it. Beth, what ideas do you have to share to start us off?
So a number of years ago, I attended a session, I think it was Tri-State, that talked about the importance of staff meetings at camp, and they challenged us to rethink our why behind them. So we returned home and we sat down with our leadership team and we spent a few hours together and we made some lists, like the reasons that we had staff meetings, the things we wanted to be sure our staff got out of them, and ideas on how we could make them more palatable for everyone, because sadly, not too many people get super excited about staff meetings. So this was a game changer for us. We came up with a plan that centered around our core values, our 4 S's: safety, stewardship, servanthood, and self-esteem. And then we revamped how we ran them. Twice a week, we had a full staff meeting. So everybody on site was together. One was on the day our campers arrived. Prior to their arrival, we had 1-week sessions. And the other one was on the day that they left. So the first one, for our big full staff meetings, we chose to make them very purposeful. We wanted to be sure that as directors, we made a connection with everybody in the room in some way. So this meant that we were the first ones in the lodge for the meeting, if it was at all possible. We were prepared with what we needed to discuss. We greeted everybody back from time off as they entered the space. And then Travis and we tried very hard to be fully present during the duration of the meeting. We made sure we did something fun or enjoyable in the meeting. We worked hard to really link the agenda with our mission. We encouraged participation in some way, and we wanted to make sure our meetings were actionable. So we wanted to be able to ask ourselves after the meeting, what did our people learn, achieve, or solve? And we also wanted to be sure that what was said during any staff meeting was pertinent to all the people in the room. So if it wasn't, we saved it for when only the necessary people were in attendance, unless it was super short, like, waterfront staff will meet at 2:30 today to go over some drills. Something like that was okay, but if we're going into depth, we took out those people later and had those specific meetings. And we also decided to have a really clear objective for each meeting. If you don't have a purpose, don't have a meeting. And we didn't want our meetings to lose focus or get off track, so we needed a facilitator for each meeting. And what we did was we shared our expectations of how the meetings would run during staff training. And we let everybody know our expectations. So things like they needed to be on time, that camp was completely tidy and ready to go before the meeting began, that all staff were expected to come prepared with pen and paper because there would always be notes that they needed to take, that they had to be in clean uniform with a fully stocked FAC, which was our first aid kit, and hats and name tags, you know, the whole bit. And we held these meetings in our lodge, and we all sat together in one really large circle. 2 staff members remained outside our dining hall to greet any families who arrived early and explain that we were in a meeting, so that they could then set them up with a treasure hunt map or coffee or juice or answer any questions until registration opened. So that's kind of how we got things started. I have a lot more tips, but I'll let Gab go next.
Awesome. Gabrielle, what would you add to this? And you want to talk a little about how your staff training meeting or staff meetings work?
Yeah, well, we have 3 different meetings traditionally throughout the summer. There's a morning meeting before the campers wake up, and then there's an afternoon meeting just during rest hour, or as we call siesta, and then there's an evening meeting after our campers go to bed. And they're all in different locations, and they're with different groups. So the morning meeting is everyone together, and it's approximately 20 minutes. And the afternoon meeting is approximately 15 minutes, and the evening meeting is approximately 10 minutes. As you can tell, it gets lesser and lesser time that we're spending time with our staff members throughout the day. At the very beginning of the summer, however, our morning meetings are longer because we do want to help with training, and we want to give a little bit more information. I think that, of course, like what Beth is saying, is that each meeting that you need to have a purpose, and everything that you say has to matter. I tend to find that that one of the things is that you really need to train leadership team members on how to run meetings and be effective, so that they're not rolling on with information that keeps going and going and going, and those points aren't being made. Just like our podcast, I do recaps at the end of our morning meetings, so that I want to highlight those 5 points that we talked about, so that after, when staff members leave, they know that these are the 5 things that is expected of them. I also think that time is really, really important, and that we don't waste people's time, meaning that we're not telling them anything that couldn't have been said, not, taking up that space, or just to a few people. Also, that we start on time and that we end on time. We've all been to meetings where meetings go longer. If you foresee that a meeting is going to go longer, that you let the group know beforehand, we're going to take an extra 5 minutes today because X, Y, and Z. So making sure that your meeting ends on time, and that you, as the host facilitator, are cutting off people if they're talking a little bit too much. Using visuals is extremely important, especially if you're in a meeting that's more than 5 minutes. Having your points articulated on a screen, on a whiteboard, or even in a skit is going to be very, very useful. And then, as I mentioned, that recap at the very end, just so people know. Michael Brandwine has a great way of dealing with staff members that do arrive late. We start all of our meetings on time. I do 2 things. One, I have leadership team members posted at the doors, so that when staff members come in, they're greeters. But once they come in, even just past 30 seconds, they take note. And then after the meeting, they go to those people and ask them how come they were late. They do that in a kind and welcoming and warm way, so that's not to intimidate anybody, and they do it in a way that's not going to also make them feel ashamed. Sometimes it could be as simple as, I planned my time wrong, I'm sorry, I won't do that again. It could be also that they're taking care of a camper, but this allows us to also see if there's any chronic behavior. What that also does is that staff members know that people are waiting for them when they arrive, and that that they're we're keeping an eye on them, and this is an expectation. We also try to do, not every single morning because it can get tedious, but a fun thing before the staff meeting, so it encourages them to come a little bit earlier. So we either doing yoga or a little dance routine or whatever that may be, and that seems to help our staff to arrive earlier. We also have coffee and tea and juice ready for them in the kitchen, not in our lodge. So when they go and get their coffee and tea, they can bring it into the lodge, but it's not a hub where people are hanging out and talking. and we need to get people's attention, they go to a separate building for that meeting. So just making sure that we're not wasting time, that you're doing a recap, and that you're making things concise.
Right on. Perfect. Yeah, your idea of having an agenda of some kind, whether that's just something that's posted and you're able to check it off, or it's on a whiteboard, or you are using slides, anything like that. I think about how, if you've ever watched Late Night with Seth Meyers, and he does the bit called "Ya Burnt," and he always has the list of all the folks. But it is kind of nice because he like checks them off, right? Like when it happens, he's like, "All right, ya burnt," and then that fades away, and then the next one shows up. And it is actually a helpful way to kind of keep things organized. So make your own "ya burnt" board. That's my first tip. So I've worked for a lot of organizations, as many of you know, and so sharing a little bit about how I've seen different staff meetings go. I worked at a big YMCA camp and had first just day camp. So the only time that we met, I'm not saying this is best practice, but I'm saying this is when we met, was we would meet after our family night program. So we would send our kids home their normal way on Fridays, and everybody would come back to camp on their own, and we would do a family program. And then after that, we would always stay and have a staff meeting, kind of recapping the session, talking about the next session. And that was really the only time everybody was all together, because we were coming in on buses, and there wasn't a great way to pull 150 staff out at one time and have 600 kids just, there. Not supervised. So that was when they chose to do it. And I would do it differently if I was there, but that was what worked. And that was when we had time to all be together. And what was tricky about that is it was right before time off. Like, we were already having a long day, and this was an extra amount of time onto this long day. Sometimes we think, well, that's motivation for people to be quiet and pay attention. And Gabs is shaking her head. And sure, there's a little bit of that, but really people are just not listening. So consider that. When we opened our resident camp, we did start doing meetings beforehand as well. And so we would get there a few hours before the campers would arrive and go through some information. That's pretty common. When I worked at Green River, our staff meetings there, again, kind of arrival day, we actually shifted to all of our arrival stuff while I was there. And we moved into the world of, we brought our staff in the night before campers arrived the next day. And we used to have our camper arrival in the morning, and then we actually pushed it to later in the day. We shifted how activities were signed up for and all that, so that our staff actually came back earlier, but then the kids didn't arrive till later, and we used all that time for meeting time. So the night before, it was all camper stuff. So they were spending time looking at files. They were doing some of the writing notes to campers, or to camper parents that were going to be sent out. Yes, we wrote some of those before the kids arrived. It's true. We would do a staff meeting, kind of reviewing some of the concerns or logistics or schedule for this upcoming season or session. And then on the morning of the day of arrival for all the campers, that morning was always professional development. So we would have 2 hours of time where we were working on something that needed to be worked on. So my staff training continued on throughout the summer, and it was fantastic. And usually midsummer, we'd have a facilitator come in and do some team building with us. And it was usually somebody who came during staff training. So it was a nice way to revisit, and he'd kind of come in and be like, hey, how's it going? And that worked really well for us. I always did a resume session and would do that in those trainings before the session, rather than trying to do that at the beginning of the summer with all that camp staff training. That's just too much. The other thing that happened when I got there was that our staff meetings were during rest hour. And so I'm a really firm believer that rest hour is sacred. And I don't think it's fair for us to ask staff members to stay during rest hour. And we also set it up that every cabin had 2 staff members. And so we'd say just one person needs to stay. Next week, it should be the other person, and make sure you communicate the information that you learned in the meeting today to your co. You can imagine there were things that were not communicated. And so I said, we're going to try something else. and it took a couple rounds of playing with the schedule to figure it out. But what we ended up doing was we moved our staff meeting times to free time, because during free time, only about 1/3 of our staff had responsibilities. So the other 2/3 of staff could come to the meeting, and we do that meeting the first day. And then the next day, we'd run the same meeting again for that other 1/3 of the staff. And that worked really pretty well. I generally started those meetings with them doing, a one-word share, how is your week going? Or share a story about, something that's going on this session. But I tried to build in, because we had about an hour, and some of that was interactive and some of that was professional development and some of it was just information dropping. But I really liked being able to start with them giving me a sense of how things were going. And then let me know how did I need to adjust my tone to make sure my information landed. If everybody was super duper tired, I probably wasn't gonna really try to just drop a whole bunch of information. I tried to ask them more questions about what was going wrong, and then say, how about you try this? This is something I've noticed. If we try this tip, this might make your life easier, right? So consider that. And then once the session ended, we had this paperwork time where our staff filled out evals on the campers and on the session and all this kind of stuff. And we took about an hour and a half to do all that, write some thank you notes to the campers. And in that time, one of the pieces of paper that was available to them to write on, they didn't have to, was suggestions for our staff meeting for the next session. And so there were some things that we would address before we dismissed them that day to go clean and reset camp for the next session. But a lot of it we would save to the next, like when they came back after their time off. So I think that's another important thing, is make sure you're asking your staff, like, what kind of stuff do they want to learn about in their staff meetings? I like to encourage them. It's not just me telling you stuff. Like, I want to tell you stuff that you want to know. So yeah, there's going to be sometimes we're talking through logistics or programs or things you haven't seen yet. But also, if you're feeling like everybody's struggling with homesickness, like, then let's tell me that and we can take some time to talk about it. And so I would ask them that in their one-on-ones that we would do throughout the summer, but also asking them on that piece of paper and just like anything you want to address, anything you want to talk about. And that just gave folks a chance to feel like they're giving some feedback. The only other thing I just want to throw in there are two other little things. So I've also worked for a program that had remote staff. So that is, we were coordinating logistics, and then we would all show up on the day of at the place to do the teaching and the program. And so if you find yourself in that situation, a lot of our information went out, like the logistical stuff went out in an email template ahead of time. And so that basic, like, what time do you need to meet there? What are the directions? What equipment do you need to bring? All of that stuff was email heavy, and we were really clear in hiring. If you are not into email, this is not the job for you, because this is the primary way that we're going to communicate that logistical stuff. And then once folks got there, we'd always, folks would gather, we'd spend 10, 15 minutes talking about the specific things we knew about that school, the specific considerations, the weather's going to get funky, so make sure you stay close, whatever it was. Then we'd take a little time to talk about that. And then before everybody departed from that site, after the program was over, we took time to debrief, and that was built into the program day. So we had another staff meeting at the end, and again, it was much more of a listening session, not a teaching session, but a lot more of collecting information about how the day went, collecting information about things we might want to know for the future, talking about curriculum updates, things like that. So all that to say, if you have a remote staff who you're kind of coordinating from all over, when you do have folks all together, prioritize that being time to get information from them and give them the tools that they need. All right, I'm gonna pause there because yeah, there's some other stuff to talk about. Beth, what else would you add about staff meetings?
So we also had meetings every day after breakfast with our resource staffs, our program staff, but they were very short, very quick, need to know kind of, here's what's happening today, here's who's driving trip, here's whatever. The counselors met every day after lunch with the head counselor, and like Ruby, it was one counselor one day, the other counselor from the cabin the next, and it was the same meeting, and very short so that they could get back and get on with their rest hours. And then on Fridays, they would have a full counselor meeting with the head counselor to do the evals and the postcards and all that kind of stuff. Well, their grandparents, their resource staff members assigned to their cabins, went in for rest hour on the Fridays. And we always had a resource staff meeting again after campfire at the end of the day, which was again a chance for us to connect together, see who needed help, see what was going on in people's lives and weeks and so on, and just connect. But those were very short. Our Sunday meetings were not short. And so I kind of want to focus a bit on that and explain why and give you some ideas about things that we did. So because we ran week-long sessions, which is different than Gab's experience and most of Ruby's, we had the opportunity to have these Sunday meetings. So we'd had 24 hours off. We'd have the staff back by 1 o'clock, and we would start those meetings then. We created our agenda for our full staff meetings together each week. So as people were entering the space, and remember Travis and I were there to do all the greeting and so on, they could add an agenda item to the whiteboard. We then chose a facilitator. So this person volunteered to be the facilitator for the week, and it could be anyone on staff, but they could not be a person who had an item on the agenda. And then they needed to remain neutral so that they could keep the meeting moving. We went over the rules of the facilitator, of course, during our practice staff meeting during training, and we gave this person permission to move people along if they were taking too long, even one of the directors. And this was a chance each week for people to really practice some facilitation skills. The meeting for us always began with singing. So we loved to sing, and it wasn't just because we personally enjoy music very much, but there is so much research out there that tells us the important benefits of people singing together. When we raise our voices with lots of other voices in a big, beautiful space like a camp lodge, it actually feels like we're altering molecules. And according to various scientific reports, we actually are altering molecules inside our brains with different changes occurring, whether it's listening to music or singing with other people. And for us, we really found the power in music, very uplifting. It heals our brains, gives us that endorphin rush, which apparently feels a lot like taking morphine. Now, I do not in any way suggest you give your staff morphine, but I suggest that you sing with them. It can also release dopamine, which is that chemical that works to regulate the pleasure and reward centers in the brain. And it's also been found to release serotonin that helps regulate moods and social behaviors. So many benefits to that. So we allowed at least 15 minutes for singing, and it was always worth it. People loved that time every week to do that together. And it allowed us to then reunite and connect again after time off and time away. So it brought us back together with that common focus and reignited our purpose and our mission. And we would then move on to our GMICs, which are great moments in camping. And the facilitator of the meeting would ask for those moments to be shared. And while people were sharing with the whole group, I've said this a couple of times before in podcasts, a book was passed around, and the people who shared were then asked to write a brief description of what it was they said. And that book has been around for close to 25 years now, and it's the same book. And each year, a new staff member gets asked to design a cover page for that year. And we still have alumni who come to camp and ask to read the GMIC book, and they find their years, and they will spend hours. Their kids have already gone into cabin, they've dropped off their own campers, and they will sit in the office or the staff lounge and read the great moments in camping. And so it allowed us to celebrate the good that we saw the week before and reinforce the mission that we are there to make everybody feel like they belong. And it also allowed folks to thank each other or acknowledge each other for hard work and really magical moments. Each person on the agenda then had an opportunity to say their piece, and the facilitator would order it. And so you spoke when the facilitator let you know it was your turn. It turned out to be mostly program staff who wanted to talk about their specific area or make announcements about the coming week. And during training, we taught all of our staff how to share this information. So we decided together that it needed to be framed in a positive way. So for example, staff weren't to come to a meeting and say, okay, stop taking scissors from arts and crafts without asking. They needed to reframe the point to say things like, could you please let me know before you take scissors from arts and crafts? We just want to be sure we have enough in the building at all times during programming for the kids. Everybody was expected to take notes during the staff meeting. They had books and pens that were in their first aid kits that we had provided them with at the beginning of the summer. And we would let them know what they needed to write down. So we'd say, okay, everybody's, a change is happening Wednesday, write this down. Like what days certain special activities might be offered, or a visitor was coming to camp, or any camp-wide concerns that we all needed to be aware of, like a specific allergy a camper had, and so on. Staff who weren't at the meeting because they were outside on parent duty for those who arrived early, or they were with campers who were staying over, they had a buddy assigned to them in the meeting, and that person was taking notes to share with them. And then they had to meet up before the end of dinner on opening day to make sure everybody was all on the same page. The theme team would then have an opportunity to get us all pumped for the week, and this announcement was expected to be really creative and really energizing. I always looked really forward to those announcements. They were always really fun. And during training, we all taught skills about how to keep this time really brief and informative. And we practiced during staff training so that people understood the why behind how we ran meetings and had a chance to see it in action before it really counted. If you have 10 extra minutes in any staff meeting, group large or small, take that time to work on a specific leadership skill. Last summer, Gabs and I created these 10-minute leadership training lessons. I think we got to 58 of them for a camp in Wisconsin that they worked through with their senior staff every day after breakfast. So why not sit down now with your leadership team and figure out what skill of the day you could teach and have time to practice at a staff meeting. So maybe for you, it's not every morning, but like at least once a week. And I think this tip would be ideal with smaller groups that have the same focus rather than your whole staff. So giving your people more skills that help them make their jobs easier and that they can use in the future after camp is always appreciated by everybody. At the end of the meeting, we always made sure there was time for questions, and we front loaded that we were looking for questions the entire group needed to hear, and that if this was a question for you or for your cabin group, that you could ask that of the appropriate staff person as soon as the meeting wrapped up. And then we'd finish up our time together, and we did have a solid start and stop time with time for our wellies. So I've spoken before about giving each member of your staff a wellness partner for the summer. We called ours wellies. And this person was the one who was there to look out for you, to make sure you were taking care of yourself, who checked in with you during the week and so on. These were very deliberate pairings. They were people of the same ages, interests, level of education, and so on. And we usually gave them 10 minutes once a week for folks to reconnect with that wellie. They were obviously encouraged to do that and find time throughout the week, but we made sure there were those 10 minutes each Sunday. And then we'd end things off by acknowledging the big picture. This is what we're trying to accomplish this week, and we're going to do this together. We also had a ritual to start the week off. The first meeting of the summer, Travis always said, "All right, everybody, in with both feet." And at every subsequent meeting, one of us would ask, "How long is summer camp?" And the staff all together would shout out 1 week, which was a reminder to us that even though we were there for 2 months or 3 or 4 months, most of our campers were only there for 1 week, and we needed to really work hard to make it special for them. So that's why we had longer staff meetings on Sundays.
I love that kind of call and response as a way to wrap it up versus like, okay, thank you, everybody. Like, that's such a nice way to say we're all on this train together. So thanks so much for sharing that, Beth. That's awesome.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Gabrielle, other thoughts on staff meetings from you?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes when we're trying to provide feedback to staff members, something that I found very useful is using statistics from surveys from the campers before the previous session. So a lot of camps will have a fun little survey for campers to do before they go. We do ours 2 to 3 days before campers leave, and then that gives us time to tally that information. And we start off the next group before the next group arrives with giving that feedback to our staff members. So because our camp requires our staff members to speak English on English days and French on French days, our campers will evaluate us on that. And so, for example, we'll say that, the majority of campers feel like we speak the language of the day. Good job, everybody. Let's keep up with this. However, when it comes to X, Y, and Z, we've dipped in the last 2 weeks. So why don't we try to put a little bit more effort here? So there's some positive stuff, there's some constructive stuff, but it's also not just from the point of view of the camp director. I find it brings a real big punch in a positive way to our staff members, and they do care about what our campers have to say. And sometimes we can get into a little bit more detail and break off into groups and say, how can we make this better? How could we remind each other? Or is there something that we need to shift in our actual program to help accommodate our campers? So maybe using surveys and statistics from your campers to help with information. I also enjoy having a small group conversations and reflections and journaling during meetings. And so certain things that you can do that we've spoken about as well is when you're starting your day, having staff members ask them questions such as, what are you excited about? And have the little group discussion. What are you nervous about? And have the group try to problem solve with that person what they're nervous about. What's one thing I should know about that we can best support you? So having staff members just saying, if you guys could help me out with this, I would feel really supported. So other things that you can have them reflect on is also, what campers am I connecting with? How can I tell? What campers am I struggling with? What have I tried to resolve this? What part of the day do I look forward to? What part of the day am I stressed out? So just having these little checkpoints, because camp is so intense and there's so many things that are happening, having these little reflection moments will really help staff members to problem solve on their own or with their peers, and also dissipate some of that anxiety and stress that they might be experiencing. You can also have them journal some of these questions and then talk about it afterwards. Again, this is something that you want to do with a smaller group and not with your entire staff, but just getting them into that mindset, and instead of being in a complacency where they're just sitting and listening, can be quite helpful. I'm just looking at my list here. Yeah. I think also one of the things that I would recommend is also doing some of these meetings during your staff training or your leadership training. We tend to have these meetings, and because we're used to them and they're already in our, we've done them many, many times before, we know what to expect. But a lot of new staff members and young staff members don't know what those meetings look like. And then they walk into them, and it's another new thing for them to learn and to get used to. So try to have these meetings during your staff training, try to mimic them so that they understand what is expected of them. But also push you to look at your camp schedule and see where in the camp day can you adjust your meeting time, your schedule time. So like Ruby, I also feel that rest hour is sacred for staff members. I will fight tooth and nail so that we don't use that time to take it away from our staff members. They need to rest. So one of the things that we did, that we realized we wanted to create that space, that siesta as a sacred time. One of the things that we did was we cut out 5 minutes off of our cabin cleanup, moved lunch 5 minutes earlier, and extended our siesta by 10 minutes. So our campers actually have a 1 hour and 10 minute in their cabin, and our meetings are 15-minute long. So our staff members have a full hour of siesta, and part of that siesta is at the very end is our meeting time. And our campers haven't noticed it. Some of our seniors are actually our younger campers haven't noticed it. That hasn't made a difference. Some of our seniors have noticed it, and what a glorious extra 10 minutes that they received. But just doing that allowed our staff members to have little checkpoints with their section heads in the middle of the day so that we could have those reflection conversations, so we could set our staff members up well for the rest of the day. So I would recommend looking at your schedule and seeing where you can maybe shimmy some of those meetings.
Right on. Such great ideas and good questions there too for folks to think about. So thanks for sharing those, Gabs. A couple other ideas that I'll throw out there. I have for a long time subscribed to Stephen McGuire's template for a staff meeting, and he starts his staff meetings with final announcements. And I love that so much. I love it so much that that's pretty much how every staff meeting, that the first information that I am communicating is the thing that I'm like, these are the things like I definitely want to make sure that they know. And like you heard Beth say, and Gab say, kind of this like recap, right? Like, let's look back and make sure we revisit what are the objectives, the things that we really want to make sure you know. I think that that's important to include those as bookends, beginning and end. Also thinking about how when I worked at a retail store, that when you came on shift, before you went out on the floor to work, we had huddles. And so whoever was coming in to start work at 4 o'clock would meet with a manager, and they'd say, okay, these are our sales goals today, focus on this thing, push this product. All right, anything you guys have questions about? Okay, cool. Go have a great day. And I think considering what does that transition time from coming off of time off or coming back into camp, what does that look like for your staff? And for a lot of us, that is happening in a meeting time, but it's not always happening in a meeting time. So consider, is there something you want to add where there is this kind of like refocus, like, hey, remember, you're here, check your baggage at the door, glad to see you back, this is what we're working on, and here we're going forward. Because I don't know that the expectation that somebody's gonna, drive back to camp, park their car, and walk into the cabin and be totally 100% camper focused is actually very real. So just consider that, as it may be something you want to consider a way to help make that transition happen. I also think a type of meeting we haven't really talked about is if you have folks who are working closely together, be that counselor pairs who are living and working together, or a staff team, your paddling staff or your climbing staff or whatever it is, that they have time built in to meet as well. And so some of that may need to happen in your larger staff meetings, but also, again, look at your schedule. Is there time in their schedule for that to happen too? Or are they having to take a rest hour to meet with those folks? And that's still not ideal, I would argue. So for instance, one of the routines that really came about while I was at Green River was our staff got to the point where they pretty much always, counselor pairs would meet after the kids went to bed. Almost always. The pairs would step outside of the cabin, have a little powwow, and then, one might need to go work in the staff lounge for a little bit for that hour before they're supposed to be back in bed before curfew. The other one would stay at the cabin, whatever. That was usually predetermined. But that routine and the staff that we saw work really well together were the ones who had that sort of routine set up. True also for program staffs that work together. They had these little huddle times where they could take a little bit of time to talk specifically and get all on the same page. So during your leadership training for those leaders of those program areas, or during staff training when you're talking about your counselors being paired up, make sure you're telling them that is an expectation. And not only that it's an expectation, but holding some space for it to happen. I think that's really important. The other thing that I'll toss in there as an exercise that we did a couple of times, that just giving your staff some time to do some of that talking and debriefing and processing as part of your staff meeting can be really, really healthy. So usually my first session or two, I would, at our end of session staff meeting, or the one right before the second session, that I would have the co-counselors get together, or the teams that work together, and I'd have them sit down and like draw a picture to represent how your session went, or something like that, something fun that wasn't just like talk to each other about how your session went. Like I would give them a little bit more of a prompt, and just for them to have 15, 20 minutes to work on that, be creative, think about it, debrief, process with each other. Again, it establishes, as Gabs has said, that somebody else on the staff can help them problem solve, and is somebody else that you can work through stuff and debrief stuff with. It doesn't always have to be me, the director. It also gave me an opportunity as the director to walk around and look at people's pictures. And so if I looked at somebody's picture and I was like, wow, that looks really rough, then I could follow up with them afterwards. So it gave me a nice little understanding of what was going on. So is there a way for you to get folks to write stuff down, draw, whatever that may look like, to give you a hint overall of what's going on with folks, but also give them an opportunity to think a little more deeply about the experiences they're having, and set them up to talk about those with other folks. So that's one activity that could go into your staff training or a staff meeting. That would be pretty simple. Other thoughts on staff meetings?
I think I'd just like to share our final staff meeting of the week. It took place on closing day, and this one was very short and very sweet. And this was a time when staff were eager to clean up, set up for the next day when a new session of kids would arrive, because they were about to get time off. So we did not want to keep them at all. Our counselors would go into the meeting at the first bell, and they had 5 minutes alone to choose the program staff person who would receive that week's Eye of the Eagle award. And that this is the point they would also hand in their camper evals and their postcards to our head counselor. The resource staff would stay outside the staff lounge for those 5 minutes, and they would choose the counselor who would receive the Eye of the Eagle award. So we chose an Eye of the Eagle award because in Celtic spirituality, people who were said to have the eye of the eagle, they were like the great bird who can soar across the sky and see the big picture and yet still be able to focus in on the tiniest of little details. So it was a great way to recognize those people at camp who were helping to really build the community. And more often than not, these were not the loud, funny, center of attention at campfire kind of people. So it was a lovely way to do that. When the second bell rang, everybody met together in the staff lounge. Everyone again sat in concentric circles, some on the furniture, others on the floor in front of the couches, but we could all see each other. We gave any necessary pieces of info that they needed to know, like who was going to be staff on site during this time off, any programs that might be running over the weekend, like our LITs were still on site, and so therefore expectations of staff if they were there. Staff who were sleeping on site signed up for duties that they did the next morning if they were staying over. And then we did something really fun to announce the coming week's counseling pairs, like, you know, giving out playing cards cut in half, and they had to go find their other half to figure out who was their co for that week. They were very short and sweet, but they were always creative. We then announced the 2 winners of the Eye of the Eagle and appreciated them for that, thanked everybody for their hard work, and all of this took less than 15 minutes max. We didn't discuss any issues of the past week. Those were obviously dealt with during the week if we knew about them, and only with the necessary individuals. If there was something we needed to discuss with the whole staff, it waited until the following day after day off when folks were rested and ready to go. 3 last things that I would suggest. I think if I were directing now, I would call them leadership meetings instead of staff meetings, to instill in our staff that these meetings have a purpose. I would ask for feedback from the staff, which we used to do, about how meetings can keep getting better. So maybe you could create like a wiki page or something and everybody could sort of add in some thoughts, or if you have another way for them to get that information. And third and final one is our full staff meetings on the Sunday usually lasted an hour or more when you were including the singing and the welly time. So we made sure that they were always getting up, moving partway through, taking notes, participating in some way, answering questions. We always had fidget toys available for those who needed to stay focused, but it was important that you weren't just talking at them for, you know, any longer than 5 minutes. As long as they get your why for each piece of the meeting, as long as they get their purpose and what's expected of them, and that each part of that meeting is for their benefit to help them fulfill your mission, they'll be all in.
For sure. Awesome. Anything else on staff meetings?
I think it's very, very, very important as a camp director to ask yourself, what do you want your staff to do with this information? And I think that sometimes we do have a list of things to tell people, but what do you actually want them to do with this? And is this something that needs a plan, instead of just asking people to do it? So be wary or be cognizant of, if you are telling staff members, hey, there's a lot of kids that don't have hats on, let's make sure it's hot, let's make sure that's happening. And then the next day it doesn't happen again, and you're thinking, okay, I'll do a reminder, and then the next day it's not happening again. Don't bring down the hammer. There's something that's not working. There's a reason. Maybe it's just because it was raining for the first 5 days and the kids are just not part of it. But grab a couple of staff members and come up with a plan where you need to make a skit for the entire camp, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been at meetings where these type of things are repeated over and over again, and it just becomes white noise. And you don't want any of your meetings to become white noise. When one part becomes white noise, then it starts to bleed into other parts. So really ask yourself, what do you want staff to be able to do with this information? And is this something that we actually need to put a solution in place and then present the solution to the rest of the staff members? And just sort of pause and reflect on that and make sure that everything is pertinent, what you're telling and what you're asking. And of course, for the people that are running those meetings, that you are supporting them. And at the beginning of the summer, it is going to take more of your time to go over how they're going to present information and how they're going to state things clearly. And you'll need to teach them that. And but this is the hub. This is how the communication starts. And we have an opportunity to role model magic and excitement and fun and creativity during these meetings. And I think that it should feel kind of exciting. We call our staff meeting staff assembly, because we do have some singing and we do have some information, and it should be a way to wake up in the morning, in the day, and greet the day.
Rock on. I'll throw in one more that I can't believe I haven't said yet, because it's like the first thing on my list, which is the thumbs up. So teaching your staff some sort of feedback, something that they can do, but do silently to say they've heard it. This was a tradition that was already in place at Green River when I got there, and I love it so much. I've taken it so many other places that, I could say, all right, and let's remember that everybody does need to wear a hat. And if you need help finding one, come talk to me and I'm happy to help you with that. And you would just see people go like this. And so that way I know it's heard by the group, I can move forward, right? Or if somebody stands up and asks a question that's like, hey, like, there are no extra hats in the lost and found, you might see everybody on staff go thumbs up, and I could tell, oh, everybody had this question. Okay, let me address this now, right? So giving some sort of visual cue that they can do silently, so that way you don't have to have a whole lot of like, but what about this? And did you all get that? Is everything good? That gives you a nice visual cue to keep things moving. Fan. All right. Cool. Well, I think it is the time. Gabs, recap our day for us.
Recap. That's the new song. Okay. So we have 4 categories: community connections, concrete information, keep in mind, and shaking things up. All right. So we're going to start with the concrete. Simple and sweet. Know your why, and make sure that your staff know your why. I'm putting this underneath the concrete section because this is vital for the people that are leading the sessions and the people that are receiving the information. Make sure that expectations are clear for both the leaders of the session and the participants in the session, such as for the participants, make sure that you come with a pen and paper and you're writing everything down. Make sure that you arrive on time and that you're focused. And for people that are leading the meetings, that it's concrete and clear. Next piece is in the concrete is making sure that your goal is clear. Is it a learning information? Are we achieving something? Are we solving something? Or is it a need to know? Those are 4 great little compartments when you're planning your meeting or your topics. Underneath community connections, why not sing, because it's a brain buzz? How about great moments in camping, 1-word shares, wellies, call and respond, Eye of the Eagle Awards, or having a little special recognition that you make your own for your camp. Something else, shake things up. How about you have a coworker meet time, skits, journaling, draw a picture, thumbs up visual recognition, or expert circles, getting your staff members to get together and share their skills and how they can support each other. And also keep in mind, constructive feedback is extremely important. Instead of saying, don't do this, make it a little bit more positive. Does this apply to everybody? Let's make sure that all the information is for everyone in the room, or have those small little groups and share that information. Check your camp schedule. Is there little nuggets of areas that you can have meetup time with your staff members where we're not taking away from their free time? What are your bookends? How do you want to start and stop? Can you create more professional development? Ask your staff what they want from their meetings. They're going to give you some great ideas and some wonderful feedback. Use also maybe some statistics from your campers to help with that information, and maybe change the names from some of your meetings from leadership meetings, staff assembly. Whatever you do this year, let's bring it up, kick it up a notch, and make sure you don't do that on your own.
Beautiful. This was a juicy episode. There was a lot in there. I love it.
There was a lot, enough for me to make categories.
Yeah.
And all of there was, and yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing, y'all. And I want to remind all of our listeners that you can get involved with our podcast by using the hashtag #CampCode on social media. Tell us what topics you'd like for us to discuss, any guests that you'd recommend that we talk to, any great leadership training tips that you have to share. We would love to hear from you, because we are all about sharing in this industry. Also, if you have found this podcast to be useful, we really appreciate it if you leave us a rating and review on your podcasting app. You can find a quick link to get to the iTunes page for that by going to camphacker.tv/cc_iTunes, or you can tweet your love of the show by going to camphacker.tv/campcodelove. And your feedback really helps keep the show going, and we'll give you a shout out if we see that that review come through. So we appreciate that. If you want to get in touch with any of us, we want to let you know how you can find us. So Beth, how can folks get to you?
Our website is gocamp.pro. They can reach me directly. My email is beth@gocamp.pro, and I'm on social media as #TopazFay.
Awesome. And Gabs?
You can check me out on Instagram at Gabrielle Rail. Rail takes 2 L's. And you can also check out where I work at ouareau.com, ouareau.com.
Rock on. And you can find me, Ruby, at rubyoutdoors.com. You can also find me on Instagram at rubyoutdoors and on Twitter at rubylyn85. And Beth is going to tell us about our next podcast.
So although our podcast is all about leadership training, we do want to talk about training employees who maybe aren't great right at the beginning. So when camp starts, you still have some work to do.
Rock on. And our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership training. And we would love to hear some of your most memorable moments or most effective tips. So again, you can tell us what they are using that #CampCode. And today, Beth has our best practice.
So before we wrapped up our staff meeting each week, Travis would ask our people, what do I need to remember about my age group? So each session we had different ages of campers. So for example, 1 week we might have juniors, 7 to 10, intermediates, 9 to 12, and so on. And he would ask the question, and then staff would share their advice by answering in this format. I need to remember that. So for example, they would say, I have 8-year-olds in my cabin this week. I need to remember that they still use concrete thinking, so I need to be really specific with my instructions and be careful not to use sarcasm. Or I have teen girls this week, and I need to remember that I'm role modeling healthy eating habits at the dining table. So get your staff involved by sharing their wisdom and helping each other remember how best to relate to their age group. Send them off feeling more prepared and ready to do their jobs.
Beautiful. So stay tuned for our next episode. And from all of us here at Camp Code, thanks for the listening, friends.